So we've all had that moment, that one moment, right? That hard thing, that tough circumstance that leaves us kind of looking up and going, God, what are you doing? God, are you up there? Do you care? We've all had that moment. Maybe you've lost a loved one. Maybe you've had an ongoing health issue that hasn't gone away. Maybe you've had to move and leave some friends or family behind. Or maybe we can just be honest and say maybe right now is that moment for you. This virus that has kind of wrecked how life works for many of us. It's made you fearful of your family or maybe even your own life. It's made you concerned about the economy and where our country may be going, or maybe even just the normal things that have been taken away that you're missing. Or some of you, you're missing out on once in a lifetime opportunities because of what is going on right now. And I understand that. And maybe this is that moment where you're left wondering, what are you doing, God? Let's just face it. It's natural. It's very, very natural to wonder what's going on, to look up and say, God, are you in control? But I think it's so incredibly important in your journey towards peace and contentment, to understanding purpose. We must rest in the fact that God is sovereign. God is sovereign. I love the ESV Study Bible's definition of the sovereignty of God. Let me read it to you. It says, God has absolute rule over creation as king, and total control and determination over all that happens. Let me read that one more time. God has absolute rule over creation as king, and total control and determination over all that happens. So before we make a beeline for kind of why that matters to us or why that matters for you, I want to take a moment to unpack this definition a little bit, really to understand what does it mean that God is truly sovereign. And one of the best ways that I've ever heard it explained was through this simple acronym. The first time I heard it, it stuck with me and I've never forgotten it. And it's this simple acronym that God has a lock on everything. Lock, L-O-C-K. He limits, orders, controls, and knows all things. By limits, here's what I mean. He sets the parameters for the world. See, what I love about Genesis 1 is it says, in the beginning, God. In the beginning, God. We know that God was there in the beginning. He created all things, and because he created all things, he gets to set the parameters for how life works for all created things. For the world, for creation, for us as a part of creation, he gets to decide how the world works. You see, one of the problems I think we have when we think about the sovereignty of God is we wrestle with this idea. I think we're born this way. We wrestle with this idea that we think we are at the center of the universe. We think about questions like, what about my will? What about freedom? What about my choices? Which are all good questions, but we think about them from the viewpoint that man is at the center of the world rather than God is at the center. You see, when God creates, he gets to determine the rules at which everything functions. Imagine this. Imagine a really skilled, gifted woodworker creates this rocking chair. And it's beautiful and it's designed to rock. And when it's sat in, it's comfortable and it works perfectly. But then this rocking chair decides, you know what? I want to be a coffee table. Or I want to be a football. Or I want to be a bicycle. That doesn't make any sense to us, right? Because the designer made it to function in a certain way. The builder made it to be a rocking chair, and its purpose is to rock, and it works when it rocks. And it's the same way with this world. God has designed the world to work in a certain way. He's at the center. He is the most important being in the universe. And we need to understand that. So the L is he limits. He sets the parameters on how the world is supposed to work. He orders. And that means he sustains all of creation. Hebrews 1, verse 3. Let's look at that. If you've got your Bible, turn to Hebrews 1, verse 3. And this is what it says. It's speaking specifically of Jesus, but he is a part of the Godhead, the God-man, the Son of God, Jesus Christ. It says, he is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. Look at that. We get this idea that God, through Jesus, is upholding creation. He's ordering creation. He is sustaining creation with the word of his power. So he limits, he orders, but then the C is he controls. That means he's actively involved in determining all that happens in the world. Everything. I love Acts chapter 17, verses 23 through 26. I want to read those together because it shows us that God is not just ruling and reigning from some far off place and he's not really involved here. This shows us his involvement even in people and nations and places. Look at this. This is in the middle of Paul addressing people at Areopagus. So he's talking with philosophers and other people as well. And he points to this statue of an unknown God. And then this is what he says. He says, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man. Nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. Then listen to this. And he made from one man, that's Adam, every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling places. Let me say that again. Having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling places. God is saying to us right now, I'm in charge of those things. I control those things. I've determined how long they will live and where they will be. I am in control. He limits, orders, and controls all things. But there's one more, which is really important to us understanding the sovereignty of God. And that's the K. He knows all things. Past, present, future, God knows. It would be scary to put power in somebody's hands without the knowledge or the wisdom that comes with it. Well, God has all of these things. And I think of Psalm 139, verses 1 through 4, where it reminds us that he knows all things. O Lord, you have searched me and you know me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up, you discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down and are acquainted with all my ways, even before a word is on my tongue. Behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. God knows all things. He limits, orders, controls, and knows all things. God has a lock. I think that helps us understand the sovereignty of God at work in our lives. But then we are sometimes left with that question of even hard things, like even coronavirus-like things, even things that happen to us, to me, to you. It helps me then to remember Joseph. You guys are probably familiar with the account of Joseph in the book of Genesis, but I want to recount a few things that we see in the account of Joseph, because I think it's helpful for us when we think about the sovereignty of God as it relates to people, real people. Remember Joseph, he was sold into slavery by his brothers, no less. And he was probably 16, maybe 17 years old when this happened, the age that many of you students, particularly you high school students, are. Then he was thrown into jail for a false accusation. You see, he was employed by this man named Potiphar, and his wife tried to seduce Joseph. And Joseph, being upstanding and wanting to honor the Lord, resisted and said, I can't treat my God or my master in this way. And then she frames him and has him thrown in jail. And then around the age of 28, he has this opportunity to interpret a dream for a baker and a cup holder. And he says, when you get out, remember me. Now, one of them is killed and the other one is restored to his position, and he doesn't remember Joseph. And then a couple years later, around the age of 30, he gets to interpret a dream for Pharaoh. And he's finally released and given actually a very prominent place in Pharaoh's household and in his kingdom. But if we do some math, that means roughly 13 years he's been enslaved and imprisoned. We don't know what portion of each, but for 13 years he's been enslaved and imprisoned. That's a rough life. Then he has this confrontation with his brothers. There's restoration as he helps them, helps feed them when really his family was going to die because they were running out of food during this famine. But then his father passes away as an old age. He passes away later in life. And some of his brothers are worried. They're actually concerned that Joseph's going to turn and come after them again. They're concerned that he's not going to actually walk out forgiveness and is going to seek vengeance on them. And that's where I want us to jump into Genesis chapter 50. I want to read a couple of verses for you, starting in verses 16. So Genesis 50, starting in verse 16. Let's read this together. So they sent a message to Joseph, because they were afraid, saying, "Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgressions of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgressions of the servants of the God of your father." Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came, and they fell down before him and said, "Behold, we are your servants." But Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me. But God," listen to this, "but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." Can you put yourself in Joseph's shoes for just a moment? Sold into slavery by your brothers at the age of 15 or 16 or 17. Wrongly imprisoned. You meant this for evil, speaking to his brothers. And God meant this for good. Put yourself in his shoes. See, Joseph understands something about the sovereignty of God that we need to grab a hold of. He knew that God was ruling and reigning. He knew that this did not happen outside of God's plan or God's care for him. And he recognized that God was doing something bigger in the midst of his suffering. So how does this matter for us, or why should we be concerned about the sovereignty of God? Well, students, let me just be honest with you, because this is how we have peace right now. Listen, there's zero chance of us having peace in this world if we don't recognize that God is sovereign. If we run around in this world pretending that he's not in control, pretending that all of these things are happening outside of his care for us, then we will be afraid. We will not have peace. But God rules and reigns over all things, including what's going on right now. He's sovereign, and we can have hope because of that. But we can also have contentment. You see, I think one of the things we're wrestling with right now is being content in the situation that God has us. But you see, if we're discontent, we're really just unhappy with God. We're ticked at him because of how life is working. Because if he rules and reigns over all things, and this is not outside his plan, then what we're wrestling with right now is his plan for us. But we can be content because we know God loves us, because we know God cares about us, and because we know he gives good gifts to his kids. But then we can also know that there is purpose, and specifically purpose for our pain. You see, God will not waste your suffering. God is not about wasting hard things. He is most concerned with your character, not your comfort. So the question we need to be asking is not, how can I be most comfortable right now in this suffering? The question we should be asking is, how can I be more like Jesus because of what I'm walking through right now? How can I allow God to work in me as I go through these things? Now, students, I want you to understand God's character his different characteristics cannot be separated easily from one another. Let me give you a few examples. If God is faithful, but not wise, that's a God who keeps his promises, but he may not make the best promises to us. Or if God is powerful but not loving, that kind of God looks more like a tyrant and less like a caring father. But if God is sovereign and not good, well, that's a scary looking God, a God who rules and reigns over all things, but doesn't care about his people and isn't good to us. But when we put them all together, we know God is faithful and he keeps his promises. We know God is wise, so he knows what's best. We know God is sovereign, so he's ruling and reigning over all things, and no one can thwart his plans. He's got a lock on everything. So as you wrestle with life right now, whatever is hard, whatever that thing is that comes to mind when you think about that moment that makes things hard, where you're wondering, God, are you there? I want you to consider that God is sovereign, that he has a lock on all things. He limits, orders, controls, and knows all things, and he loves you. And so what he's doing right now falls under his loving care for you. So it can bring you peace, it can bring you contentment, and it can bring you purpose in the midst of everything. Students, I'm gonna toss a few questions up on the screen in just a moment, and I'd love you to pick one or two of them to think about and write a few answers down for, so you're more prepared to have a conversation with your D groups a little bit later. We're looking forward to spending time with you. We love you. We miss gathering with you. We look forward to that day when we can do that again. But you are loved, not just by me and not just by your leaders, but by a sovereign God who rules and reigns and has a lock on everything. We'll see you a bit later, guys.